All right, world. Very glad to be with you today. Sam Lichtenstein, Director of Analysis, here again with Adriana Bassoni, also Director of Analysis. You have hopefully the sharpest mind sitting across from me on our team. We're here today to, of course, be discussing what's in the news that you can't get away from. We all need to be talking about, which is, of course, the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And Adriana, before we talk about what this means, I think it would be helpful because, to be honest, a lot of people out there don't understand how we got here. So can you give us a little background?
Yeah, basically, Russia considers that having a pro-Russian government in Ukraine is of strategic importance. Russia was unsatisfied with the way that political events were developing in Ukraine over the past decade, especially since the revolution of 2014 that deposed the previous pro-Russian government and replaced it with a pro-EU, pro-West government. Russia saw that as unacceptable. For Russia, having this idea of strategic depth, which is some degree of separation, some buffer protecting itself from NATO, is essential. So we have seen Russia taking that policy to extremes over the past few days. First, by recognizing the independence of breakaway territories in eastern Ukraine, and then staging an invasion from the north, from the east, and from the south of the country, which, as we speak, unfortunately, are at the gates of Kiev. So things are unfolding very fast, and things are really, really worrying for us watchers, and especially for people in Ukraine.
Yeah, and I think it's also worth adding on to that. As we've seen, there's kind of this political, military, strategic calculation that the Russian government has made.
Yeah.
But it also seems like there's almost an intensely personal feeling that Vladimir Putin and his administration have about this. And you can see that just in his rhetoric in justifying this, going back towards blaming Lenin, referring to the government in Kiev basically as anything but a legitimate government, talking about being populated by Nazis, etc. It almost seems like there's a deeply personal feeling here on top of all these other more geopolitical, geoeconomic reasons.
Yeah, his speech from a few days ago was really, really surprising. He basically denied the existence of Ukraine as a sovereign nation. He basically said that it was an invention of the Soviet Union that should never have been allowed to happen. And he's kind of trying to correct that, for lack of a better term, by making sure that Ukraine is either a part of Russia or is a semi-independent republic which depends politically, economically, and militarily on Russia. In a way, one of the many ideal outcomes for Russia, I think, or for Putin, would be to have something similar to what happens in Belarus, which is a country where pretty much the same regime has been in place for the past 30 years, where there are basically very little political, civil rights, where there are elections, quote unquote, but the same guy wins by a 80-90% margin, and the country is deeply, deeply dependent on Russia. So that's kind of the situation that Putin seems to be seeking in Ukraine.
Well, and that's a good segue because, as you noted, this is obviously a very fluid situation. As we're recording this, we know that there's intense fighting outside of Kyiv. What we don't know, of course, is what the ultimate political, military, and territorial goals are of the Russian government. You just laid out one scenario. It also seems to me that given this very kind of almost ideological feeling that Putin has about the country, that makes it all the more unpredictable. Because, of course, from our perspective in the West, I think a lot of people don't see the quote unquote rationality of some of these moves. But there's an inherent, concern that we're trying to proverbially mirror image, and that our version of rationality is not necessarily the same calculations, and that makes it very challenging and concerning because what he may view as the ultimate goal doesn't necessarily need to line up with what we may perceive as logical.
Yeah, and speaking of the ultimate goal, we were just having this conversation. For people watching, we at RAIN, we have daily meetings where all of our geopolitical analysts discuss the main events of the day and try to think about what the future would look like. And we were thinking about what's the end game, right? What will Ukraine look 6 months from now, 12 months from now, 5 years from now, right? And right now there are several options on the table. I would say there's a scenario in which Russia takes control of the entire country and they replace the current democratically elected pro-Western government with some kind of puppet regime that responds to Russia. But there's a scenario where Ukraine is actually partitioned in at least two states, right? An eastern state that is controlled and probably only recognized by Russia, and a western state where whatever's left of the pro-European government is still in place. But these are just two of the many potential outcomes. There's been talks about Ukraine making concessions to Russia, like rewriting the constitution to promise that Ukraine will never join NATO, potentially granting additional self-governing powers to the eastern regions where most of the ethnic Russians live. But it's just, at this point, it's basically speculation.
And one of the other options that's been discussed in sometimes in a positive and sometimes in a negative light has been the idea of Finlandization, which of course refers back to the status that Finland held during the Cold War, where basically it was heavily under Russian influence, but it was not occupied, and basically had this unique status where it tried to toe the line between East and West. It seems to me like in the 21st century, that is not going to be a sustainable solution here. And I quite frankly don't know if the Putin's administration would accept anything less than at least some sort of firm control from Moscow over at least some portion of Ukrainian territory.
Yeah, and this is where the short versus long-term issue becomes central, right? Because there is a chance that whatever outcome we see in the next few weeks is not sustainable in the long run. As we have discussed, let's assume, just for argument's sake, that Russia tries to impose a puppet state with a puppet government. Will the Ukrainian population tolerate this? Will Russia have to be permanently involved just with its security forces on the ground just to make sure that the regime survives? Because it's not a given that in the long run, Ukrainians will tolerate to live as people live in Belarus, right? Where they have like very limited liberties. So even if we see some kind of settlement in the short term that kind of prevents a greater bloodshed and prevents an escalation of the killings and destruction, it may not be sustainable, right? So one thing is clear, this is going to be a geopolitical issue at the core of Europe for a long time.
I'm glad, well, I'm sad, but for the purpose of this conversation, I'm glad that you phrased it that way, because in all honesty, to me, it seems like the discussion of now re-entering some sort of a new security paradigm, unlike in most cases, this is actually one of those events that does trigger that. I mean, we've seen Russia invade, of course, a very small portion of Ukraine previously in 2014 and take territory, and that was already seen as escalatory. We've seen, of course, the war in Georgia, where Russia also carved out basically pro-Russian areas. But again, that didn't have the same effect. Now, just geographically speaking, we're talking about Russian forces truly in Central Europe, effectively, already farther west than some of the Eastern European members of NATO are. And of course, with Belarus just to the north, which is, of course, essentially a Russian client, where Russian forces are based, and notably where Russian forces invaded from the north down into Kiev area towards the south, you effectively have now a Russian client that, when you pair it with actual Russian territory in Ukraine, is only about 60 miles from Kaliningrad, which is, of course, the Russian outpost that's effectively in between Poland and Lithuania. And that's a big concern about that extension of Russian territory all the way that deep into NATO.
Yeah, exactly. And this begs the question about how will the West react to all of this, right? We have seen first, after Putin's announcement of the recognition of the breakaway, republics. And then after the proper invasion, we saw 2 rounds of sanctions. Of course, the second round was much tougher, much stricter sanctions. They are targeting technology exports to Russia. They are limiting Russia's access to financial and capital markets in the West. They are making it illegal for people in the West to purchase sovereign debt from Russia. They are banning the export of certain goods. So in a way, they are trying to cripple the Russian economy. But this is when the long-term versus short-term dynamic come at play again, because these are sanctions that will only inflict economic pain on Russia in the long run. It could be months, if not years, before Russia feels the full impact of these sanctions. So the question is, will it affect the short-term behavior of Russia? Russia has been planning this for months, possibly, so they may have already priced in, the economic cost.
Absolutely. And what's also clear from the sanctions and responses is that even if they don't necessarily cause a short-term change in Russian behavior, they're already being seen as having short-term consequences for Western countries. That's either inhibiting them from taking some stronger actions, or in some cases, basically accepting those costs, but they may not be sustainable over time. I mean, this is one of those situations where the West understands that politically there needs to be a significantly robust response, if for no other reason than to kind of appease a domestic audience that knows that there needs to be something strong to be seen as standing up to the Russians. But at the same time, there's obviously a level at which the West is certainly not going to get involved militarily. And so if it's not willing to commit proverbial, blood and treasure to retaking territory, Russia, from my perspective, essentially seems to have accomplished its goal. And as you said, is likely priced in and is clearly willing to accept any sort of economic, diplomatic, or other penalties it may receive.
Yeah, and then there's the issue of all the very awkward questions that this is raising, right? There was Germany's position vis-a-vis the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, which was supposed to transport Russian gas to Germany. They put pause on that and they said, okay, maybe this is not such a good idea after all. But over the past 24 to 36 hours, we have seen the European debate over whether or not to cut off Russia from the SWIFT international payments system, right? And some countries, especially in Central and Eastern Europe, like Poland, Lithuania, Estonia, Latvia, they are saying, let's cut them off. Let's just make it impossible for them, or at least extremely hard for them, to access foreign currency, to pay for international transactions. But then you have countries like Germany, again, and to a lesser extent, Italy, France, and others saying, yeah, well, but if we cut off them from SWIFT, they may argue that they have no way of getting our payments for their natural gas. So they may cut supplies of natural gas to Europe, which will create big economic problems, especially for Central and Eastern Europe. So you have this extremely uncomfortable situation in which the tools you have to hurt the economy of your rival would also hurt your own economy, right? And a point could be made, this is a reminder of the many reasons why Europe should be less dependent on Russian energy, right? There's the Green Deal package in place. They are trying to rely more on renewable energies, LNG exports from other parts of the world, build as many pipelines connecting to other countries as they can. But we are talking about a process that could take decades, not months. So there is not an easy fix for the current dilemma the European Union finds itself in.
No, definitely not. And what's remarkable, as you just noted, is the ripple effects this has. And I'll take it one step further. Obviously, Europe being the most obvious place, but there are so many ways in which this conflict is going to have both short and long-term implications for regions that people don't even realize. For instance, you mentioned obviously Russia being a huge supplier of natural gas to Europe. Well, Ukraine and Russia are also huge suppliers of wheat to a lot of countries in North Africa and the Middle East. And the idea of wheat prices and in turn bread prices spiking which has already been the case in the past few months for a variety of pandemic and other related factors. Now seeing them surge even further, we're talking about people all of a sudden not being able to put food on their table, and possibly the return of things like bread riots, other challenges. So the conflict is going to have these ripple effects in ways that are both very obvious at first, but also some of these kind of secondary things that may not be immediate for a lot of the people following this.
Yeah, and we have already seen the effects on oil prices, which happened at a time when Europe and to a lesser extent the US are already facing with COVID-related inflation. So this will only add to that. If inflation was already a source of concern in the West, this adds to that. So all in all, it's an event that, as you said, Sam, it's currently having already implications well beyond Ukraine's border. So it's truly a global issue, I would say.
Well, we could certainly talk about this for, unfortunately, a very long time, but obviously UI and the rest of our team, we're continuing to monitor this for our readers and our clients. I unfortunately foresee that weekend plans, I will have to be on my phone as much as I don't want to do that. But for those of you that are interested in learning more and understanding the various ways in which this crisis is affecting the world, please make sure to check out all of our content, not only on social media, but of course on our website directly. We have a huge number of experts in everything from the political aspects of this to the economics, et cetera. And it's really a crisis that unfortunately is going to involve all of these deeper thinkers to think through what it's going to mean for the world going forward.
Yeah.
All right, well, with that, we'll leave the weekend. Obviously, we'll be monitoring, and we hope everybody out there stays safe.
Have a great weekend.